There is a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels full. Full of something waiting. You know that feeling, don't you? When a place holds its breath around you. When the air goes still and the world seems to lean in, like it's listening to see what you'll do next. Most people walk away from that feeling. They call it instinct, or superstition, or fear. They turn around, and they drive home, and they pour a glass of something warm, and they never think about it again. But some people walk toward it. Elias Cole was one of those people. He had always been one of those people, though he never would have described himself that way. He was a quiet man, a careful man, a man who measured twice and spoke once and spent more evenings alone than with company. He worked as a land surveyor for the county of Harrow, a stretch of open, wind-flattened country in the high plains of the interior, where the sky was enormous and the towns were small and most of the roads didn't have names, only numbers, and even those numbers were easy to miss if you weren't paying close attention. He was 38 years old when it happened. 38, and already he had the eyes of a man 10 years older. Not hard eyes. Tired ones. The kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying something invisible for too long. His wife, Clara, had left 2 years before. Not with anger. Not with cruelty. Just with a quiet certainty that had broken him more than shouting ever could have. She had looked at him across the kitchen table one Sunday morning, the coffee going cold between them, and said, "I don't think we're doing each other any good anymore." And that had been the end of it.
A sentence.
A cup of coffee. A door that closed softly and didn't open again. He hadn't moved out of the house they'd shared. He told himself it was practical. The house was paid for. The job kept him in Harrow County. But the real reason, the one he didn't say out loud even to himself, was that leaving felt like agreeing it was over. And some part of him wasn't ready to agree to that yet. So he stayed. And he drove those nameless roads. And he measured land that no one else seemed to care about. And he let the silence become his company. On the morning it happened, he was out early. The sky was the color of pewter, heavy and low, the kind of sky that doesn't threaten rain so much as it threatens endurance. It had been like that for 3 days. No storms. No sun. Just that oppressive gray pressing down on everything like a hand on a shoulder. He was following Route 9 north, a dirt road that cut through the far edge of his survey zone, heading toward a parcel of land that had recently changed ownership. A sale of 200 acres, mostly scrub and old fencing. The new owner wanted the boundaries confirmed. It was routine work. It always was. He had been driving for 40 minutes when he first noticed the house. It sat about a quarter-mile off the road, at the end of a track that had once been a proper lane and was now mostly reclaimed by grass. The house itself was 2 stories. Clapboard siding. A wide porch that sagged slightly on the left side. A rusted weather vane on the roof that pointed south and didn't move, despite the thin wind that was moving across everything else. Elias slowed the truck without quite deciding to. He pulled the survey map from the seat beside him and looked at it. The parcel he'd been sent to mark was another half-mile up the road. This property wasn't on his list. He had no reason to stop. He stopped anyway. He sat there for a moment with the engine idling, looking at the house through the dusty windshield. Something about it caught him. Not in a frightening way, not at first. More the way a painting catches you, when you walk past it in a corridor and your feet slow without your permission and you find yourself standing there, not sure why, only knowing that something in the image has reached out and taken hold of you. The house looked empty. Clearly empty. The windows were dark and one of the upper panes was cracked. The porch railing was broken in 2 places. But the structure itself was sound. It hadn't fallen in on itself the way truly abandoned places do. It was just waiting. He turned off the engine, got out. The air outside was cold in a way that felt deliberate. He zipped his jacket and stood by the truck for a moment, looking down the overgrown track. There was no mailbox, no name, no marker of any kind. Just the lane and the house and the silence and that enormous gray sky above it all. He started walking. The grass along the track came up past his ankles in places, heavy with old dew. His boots darkened quickly. He walked slowly, not because he was cautious, but because the place seemed to demand a certain pace. Rushing would have felt wrong here. Everything about this place suggested that time moved differently. That hurrying was beside the point. He reached the porch and stood at the bottom of the steps. 3 wooden steps. The middle one had cracked lengthwise but not broken through entirely. He tested it with 1 foot before committing his weight. It held. The front door was slightly open. Not wide open. Not thrown back dramatically. Just ajar by a few inches, the way a door gets when someone pulls it shut behind them and it doesn't quite catch in the frame. An ordinary, accidental gap. He pushed it the rest of the way with 2 fingers. The interior was dim. The gray light from outside fell through the open door and through the windows in pale, flat rectangles, illuminating dust motes that moved slowly in the disturbed air. He stood in the doorway and looked in without entering. The front room was furnished. That stopped him. He had assumed the house was empty, gutted, cleaned out by whoever had last owned it and sold it off or walked away from it. But it wasn't empty. There was a sofa against a far wall, a low table in front of it, a lamp in the corner with no bulb in the socket. Along the left wall, a fireplace with a simple wooden mantel, and on the mantel, things. A tin box, a folded piece of cloth, a small framed photograph. He stepped inside. His boots on the floorboards made the only sound in the world. He crossed to the mantel and looked at the photograph. It was old, black and white. A man and a woman standing in front of what appeared to be this very house, though the house in the photograph was newer, the porch railing intact, the paint fresh. The man was tall and thin with a serious expression. The woman was shorter, her hair pinned up, and she was not looking at the camera. She was looking at something to the left of the frame. Her expression was soft and private, as though whatever she saw there was hers alone. Elias studied the photograph for a long time. Then he turned and looked around the room more carefully. The sofa cushions had gone flat and pale. There was a thin coat of dust on everything, but not the thick accumulation of years. More like the dust of months, of a place that had been left, but not long ago. He moved down the short hallway to the kitchen. On the kitchen table, there was a cup. A single ceramic cup, turned upright, sitting in the center of the table as though someone had sent it down and meant to come back for it. He leaned over it. There was nothing in it. No stain of tea or coffee. No residue. Just the clean, hollow interior of a cup that had been placed there with intention. He straightened, looked out the kitchen window at the back of the property. More scrubland. An old fence. The remains of what might once have been a small garden, now just a rectangle of darker earth bordered by rotting wood. And then he heard it. Upstairs. A sound. Not loud. Not violent. Something between a footstep and a settling, the kind of sound old houses make when the temperature shifts, except that it wasn't random. It came twice, in rhythm, with a pause in between. Like weight shifting from one foot to the other. He stood very still. The sound came again. The same rhythm. The same deliberate quality. He looked at the ceiling. His heart had not quickened. That surprised him. Something in this house was working on him differently than fear. It felt more like recognition. as if some part of him had been moving toward this moment for a long time without knowing it. He went back to the hallway. The staircase rose from the far end of it, narrow and steep, the banister worn smooth on the top rail from years of hands passing along it. He looked up. The upper landing was dark. The sound did not come again. He climbed. The stairs complained quietly under him. He kept his hand on the banister and moved slowly, not because he was afraid, but because haste still felt wrong. The house was asking him to be patient. He was trying to listen. The landing at the top was small. 2 doors, both closed. A window at the end that faced west, the curtain half drawn across it. He stood there. He was not sure how long. Then the door on the left moved. Just slightly. An inch, maybe less, swinging inward from some current of air, or from no cause he could identify. Through the gap, the room beyond was dark. But not entirely. He pushed the door open. The room was a bedroom. A single bed with a metal frame. An old dresser with a cracked mirror above it. And sitting in the chair by the window, with the thin gray light falling across her lap and her hands folded in her lap and her eyes open and looking directly at him, was a woman. She was old. 70, perhaps. Perhaps older. Her hair was white and pulled back. Her face was deeply lined but composed. She wore a cardigan the color of ash and a long dark skirt, and she was watching him with an expression that was not surprise. Not fear. Not anger. She looked as though she had been expecting him. "You took the long road," she said. Her voice was low and even. It filled the room without effort, the way voices do when they have had a long time to settle into their own certainty. Elias stood in the doorway. He felt many things at once, most of them contradictory. He felt he was trespassing. He felt he was exactly where he was meant to be. He felt the 2 years since Clara had left stretching behind him like a road he hadn't chosen. He felt something loosen in his chest that had been held tight for a very long time. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know anyone was here." The door was open. "Doors are often open," she said. "People still choose not to come in." He didn't have an answer for that. He stood there and let it settle. "Sit down," she said, nodding toward the edge of the bed. He sat. He would think about this later, about how strange it was that he sat, how entirely natural it felt, how he didn't question it in the moment. He would think about how this was the first time in 2 years that being in a room with another person had not felt like an effort. Her name, she told him after a while, was Ruth. Ruth V. She had been born in this house. She had grown up in this house. She had left it at 19 to marry a man she loved more than was probably sensible, and she had come back to it at 71 when that man was gone and her children were grown and scattered, and she found herself needing a place that remembered her from before she had become anyone to anyone. "This house knows me," she said simply. "It knew me when I was small." Elias listened. He was good at listening. He had always been good at it, but it was a skill that had gone unused for so long that using it now felt both natural and strange, like using a muscle after an injury. But gentle ache alongside the ease of it. He told her, without quite meaning to, about the survey work, about the nameless roads, about Clara. Not all of it. Not the specifics, but the shape of it. The shape of a life that had been quietly coming undone and then had come undone entirely and had not yet found a new form. Ruth listened with the same quality of attention she had given to everything else. Patient. Unhurried. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the pale sky. "You stopped in front of this house," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "What?" He thought about it honestly. "I don't know." She nodded, as though this was the correct answer. Most of the things worth doing, we don't know why we're doing them until after. If you found yourself still here, still listening, still following along this quiet road with Elias and Ruth, then maybe you already belong somewhere in this story too. You can leave a like if it's moved you, or simply stay a little longer. We're in no hurry here. Outside, the sky had begun to shift. Not toward brightness exactly, but toward a different quality of gray, the kind that comes just before things break open. Elias had not noticed until now that several hours had passed. The light had changed. The afternoon was somewhere behind him and the early evening was reaching forward. He stayed until dusk. They didn't talk the whole time. That was one of the things he remembered afterward, the quality of the silence between the words. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was a silence that had been broken in and worn soft, like old leather. A silence you could rest in. She made tea at some point. He didn't ask how she had the things to make it with, and she didn't explain. She came back up the stairs with 2 cups and set one on the dresser within his reach and sat back down in her chair and looked out the window as if watching for something only she could see. My husband used to say that a house that has known love never fully loses it, she said, after a long while. He said the walls keep a kind of warmth, even when it's cold. Do you believe that? She thought about it. I believe that's what I came back here to find out. She paused. And I think the answer is yes. Elias looked around the room. At the cracked mirror. At the plain bed frame. At the faded curtain and the worn floorboards and the simple ordinariness of all of it. And he felt, for no reason he could have explained to anyone, that she was right. There was something here. Not dramatic. Not supernatural. Just the residue of a life that had been lived with attention, with care, with the kind of love that leaves a mark on a place the way water leaves a mark on stone. Slow. Undeniable. Patient. He drove home in the dark with the truck windows cracked and the cold air coming in and the road spreading out ahead of him and the headlights like something being unrolled just in time for his arrival. He thought about Clara. He thought about the Sunday morning in the cold coffee and the soft voice that had said, "I don't think we're doing each other any good anymore." And for the first time, he thought about it without the familiar tightening in his chest. He thought about it the way you think about something that happened a long time ago. Sad, perhaps.
True.
Certainly. But no longer the center of gravity around which everything else orbited. He thought about what Ruth had said, about not knowing why you do the things worth doing until after. He had pulled off that road without deciding to. He had walked down that lane without choosing to. He had sat down in a stranger's bedroom and told her things he hadn't told anyone, and he had no explanation for any of it. Only the feeling, quiet and certain, that something had shifted. That some door had come slightly ajar inside him the way the front door had been ajar in the house. And that he had, for once, decided to push it open instead of walking away. 3 weeks later, he went back. He told himself he was in the area for work, which was true but not the reason. He drove down Route 9 North and slowed at the track and pulled over and looked down toward the house. It was the same. Quiet. Still. The porch sagging gently on the left side. But the front door was closed. He walked down the lane anyway. Went up the steps. Knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Nothing. He tried the handle. Locked. He stepped back and looked up at the second floor window. The curtain was fully drawn now. The chair, as far as he could tell, was empty. He stood on the porch for a long time. He walked around the side of the house to the back, past the remnants of the old garden, and there he found it. A small stone set in the ground near the back fence. Simple. Unmarked except for 2 initials in a pair of dates. The dates were close together. The stone was not new. It had been there for a while, long enough to be weathered, long enough to have sunk slightly into the earth and been claimed by the grass growing around its base. He crouched in front of it and looked at it. He thought about a woman in a chair by a window, watching a pale sky. He thought about her voice, its certainty, its strange warmth. He thought about how she had looked at him when he stepped into the doorway, as though she had been waiting, as though she had known he would come. He did not know what to think. He was not a superstitious man. He was a man of measurements, of clear lines and confirmed boundaries. He dealt in what could be verified. But he had been there. He had sat in that room. He had held a cup of tea that was warm in his hands. He had heard her voice filling the space with its unhurried certainty. He had heard her say, "Most of the things worth doing, we don't know why we're doing them until after." He stood up slowly and looked at the house one more time. The weather vane on the roof had turned. It was pointing east now. The wind, he noticed, had picked up slightly. A cold, thin current moving across the land from the direction of the mountains. The grass around the old garden border stirred gently. A sound moved through it, dry and soft, like paper folded and smoothed and folded again. He walked back to his truck. He drove to the county records office that afternoon and asked about the property. The clerk looked it up without much interest and told him that the parcel had last been recorded in the name of 1H NRV, that the deed had not been updated in decades, and that as far as the county knew, there were no living heirs and the property had quietly reverted to a kind of administrative limbo that no one had gotten around to resolving. "Is there anyone who would know more about it?" Elias asked. The clerk shrugged. "You might try the old cemetery out near the Miller Road Junction. A lot of the older families from that area are out there. Sometimes there's someone around who knows who's who." He drove to the cemetery that evening, just before the light left entirely. He walked the rows slowly, reading names on stones. Most of them were familiar in the way that old names in small places are familiar, not known personally, but known as part of the texture of a place. The same surnames on mailboxes in an old newspapers and on the painted sides of faded buildings. He found them in the far corner, near the fence. Howard Vay. And beside him, Ruth Vay. He stood very still. He looked at the dates. Ruth Vay had died 11 years ago. He stood there in the cooling air as the last of the light drained out of the sky and the first stars appeared above the plain, faint and steady, and he turned this fact over in his mind the way you turn something over in your hands when you're trying to understand its shape. He was not a superstitious man. He was a man who confirmed things, measured things. He knew what he had experienced. He knew the warmth of the cup. He knew the sound of her voice. He knew the weight of the chair she had sat in when he had pressed his hands against the edge of the bed frame and felt it solid and real beneath him. He could not explain it. He stayed at the cemetery until the dark was complete. And then he drove home. He didn't sleep much that night. But it was not an anxious sleeplessness. It was the kind that comes when your mind is quietly rearranging itself, sorting things into new configurations, making room for things that don't fit the old categories. He lay on his back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and let it happen. In the morning, he made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window, the way he had stood it in 1,000 mornings before, watching the early light move across the backyard. But this morning it looked different. The yard he had let go wild since Clara left, the overgrown grass, the garden bed he hadn't touched, the wooden fence slowly silvering with weather, all of it looked different to him now. Not worse than before. Not better. Just different. As though it had been there all along and he had only just agreed to see it. He thought about what Ruth had said about the walls keeping warmth. About love leaving a residue in a place. He thought about this house, Clara's house, his house, the house they had chosen together on a bright September afternoon when everything still seemed wide open and possible. He thought about the evenings they had spent in this kitchen, the arguments, the laughter, the silences that were good silences, the kind he had been trying to remember how to have again with someone, anyone. He had told himself he stayed because it was practical, because it was paid for, because leaving meant agreeing. But maybe that wasn't it at all. Maybe he had stayed because this house knew him, the way Ruth's house knew her, the way old places hold the shape of the lives that have moved through them, pressed into the floorboards and the window frames in the particular quality of light on certain afternoons. He set down his coffee and went outside and stood in the yard. He spent the rest of the day working, not surveying, just working, cutting the grass, pulling the dead growth from the garden bed, repairing the latch on the back gate that had been broken since the previous winter. Small things, physical things, things he could see the result of. When he finished, in the late afternoon, he stood back and looked at the yard. It was not transformed. It was not beautiful. It was just tended, cared for, given attention it had been waiting for. He felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than that. More like the absence of a particular kind of weight. Like setting down something heavy you'd been holding for so long you'd stopped noticing you were holding it. He thought about Ruth one more time as the light moved toward evening. He didn't know what to call what had happened out at the house on Route 9 North. He didn't try to fit it into a category. He only knew that something had been said to him in that room that he had needed to hear. And that the woman, or whatever she had been, had looked at him with the patience of someone who had learned, over a very long time, that everything arrives eventually. That the things worth finding have a way of making themselves findable if you're willing to slow down and follow the road and step through the open door. Even when every practical instinct tells you there's no reason to stop. He went inside and cooked a proper meal for the first time in months. Something with actual effort in it, not just bread and cold things from the refrigerator. He sat at the kitchen table and ate it slowly and listened to the sounds of the evening outside. The wind, the settling of the house, the small, ordinary music of a place that had known life and still contained the echo of it. He was still there at the kitchen table an hour later, the plate pushed aside, a second cup of coffee cooling in his hands, when his phone lit up with a message from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't open it. He did. It said, "The front door is unlocked again, in case you need somewhere to be." He stared at it for a long time. He didn't go back that night, or the next, but he kept the message. And on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks later, when the sky was finally clear for the first time in what felt like months and the light across the plain was golden and wide and full of a warmth he hadn't expected, he found himself on Route 9 North without quite having decided to go there. He pulled off at the familiar track, walked down through the ankle-high grass, climbed the porch steps, testing the middle one as he always did. The front door was open, just a few inches. Just enough. He pushed it gently and stepped inside and stood in the dim, warm quiet of the front room. The dust had settled. The photograph was still on the mantel. The man and the woman in front of the house on some bright day decades gone, and the woman looking at something off to the left with that private, soft expression. He looked at it for a while. Then he went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, and he sat down at the table. And he waited. And the house settled quietly around him, and the light moved slowly through the window, and everything was exactly as still as it needed to be. Some places choose you. Some doors open before you've decided to knock. And some silences, if you're patient enough to sit inside them, turn out to be the fullest things you've ever known. Elias Cole came back to that house every few weeks for the rest of that year. He never saw Ruth again, but he always felt her there, in the quality of the air, in the warmth that lingered even on cold mornings, in the small, unhurried sense of rightness that settled over him the moment he crossed the threshold. He started sleeping better. He started eating properly. He called his sister for the first time in over a year, a conversation that lasted 2 hours and ended with both of them slightly embarrassed by how long they'd let things go quiet between them. He didn't go back to Clara. He didn't try to. But he thought about her with something closer to tenderness now than to grief. He wished her well, genuinely, the way you wish well on a road you once traveled but do not travel anymore. The following spring, he put in a small garden at his own house. Just a rectangle of turned earth bordered by new wood. He didn't know much about growing things, but he tried. He asked questions. He made mistakes. He started again. One afternoon in June, he was in the hardware store buying stakes for the tomato plants when he met a woman named Lena, who was arguing cheerfully with the man behind the counter about the proper distance for spacing pepper seedlings. She had dirt on her wrists and a very decided opinion on the subject. He found himself smiling before he'd noticed he was smiling. He didn't think about Ruth in that moment. But later, driving home with the stakes in the truck bed, he did. He thought about sitting in that quiet room with the gray light falling. About a cup of tea. About a voice that filled a space without effort. About a woman who had come home to be remembered from before she'd become anything to anyone. He thought about a door that was slightly open, and about choosing to step through it. He thought about how none of it had made sense, and how all of it had been exactly what it needed to be. He pulled into his driveway and sat in the truck for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. The garden was visible from where he sat. A small, tented thing, new and uncertain, reaching toward whatever was coming. He got out, and he went inside, and he let the door close softly behind him. If this story found you in a quiet moment, and stayed with you a little after it ended, you can leave a like below. It means more than you might think. And if you have thoughts you'd like to share, or memories this brought up for you, the comments are a gentle place to leave them. If you'd like to return to stories like this one, calm, slow, and told with care, you're welcome to stay and subscribe. We'll always leave the door slightly open.